On behalf of my wife, Catherine, and myself, I would like to publicly thank Papastavros and Presbytera Georgia Kofinas for their many years of love and friendship, and also encouragement and support. I'm indebted to him for his mentorship and look forward to many future collaborations in Charlotte, North Carolina, his birthplace and his home, and again in 3 years, God willing, in Greece, where he currently resides. It is my honor this afternoon to introduce our next speaker, Father Vasilios Thermos, Protopresbyter of the Holy Metropolis of Thebes and Levadia, Church of the All-Magnificent Archangels. Father Vasilios is a psychiatrist for children and adolescents. He teaches pastoral theology and pastoral psychology at the Graduate Ecclesiastical Academy of Athens. He has been involved in clergy training and is the editor of the Greek journal Psychiatrist, Ways of the Soul, which serves the dialogue between psychologists and psychiatrists with faith and theology. His doctoral dissertation is on the psychology of priestly vocation. He has worked on clergy burnout and has published the results of his survey among Orthodox priests. Father Vasilios will address us today on the topic, From Darkness to Light, Hope in Mental Disorders.
Σεβασμιότατοι, σεβαστοί πατέρες, κυρίες και ο εκκλησιαστικός λόγος που παραδοσιακά καλλιεργείται για τον ανθρώπινο πόνο, όπως έχουμε υπόψη μας, συνήθως συνδέει την νόσο και την ελπίδα μέσα από δύο δρόμους. Ο πρώτος δρόμος
is based upon philanthropy and the almightiness of God, which also reveal themselves through Virgin Mary and the angels, begs for relief and cure. The holy unction and the many different prayers of the sacramentary, as well as the supplicatory canons to the Theotokos and the saints, constitute the most notable cases in point. Here hope aims at casting aside the natural laws, and in particular the laws governing the natural course of the disease, as we say in medicine, and gears to a miraculous positive outcome. The second path, which relates disease with hope, aims at the spiritual progress which Spain has the ability to secretly plan, and we've heard quite a lot said on the matter up until now. Long-hold ecclesiastical experience corroborates that even in the cases in which we do not have cure, nor betterment for that matter, the faithful has the opportunity to transform oneself through Christ by means of humility and patience, sanctified to a point that perhaps would never have been reached had it not been for the disease. This introduction comprises known theories that are emphasized before and have been elaborated on. These are notions that nourished spiritually innumerable members of the Church during their course and supported people in the painful struggle against the disease. And we shouldn't forget here that we always talk about the ecclesiastical perception of hope. Hope could never have had such potential had it been used with the common sense of the word. The common meaning of hope in the secular speech, the non-ecclesiastical one, makes mention to this pleasant emotion which is generated by the co-evaluation of different factors. In the secular framework, we hope for what the conditions allow us to hope or encourage us to hope. Doctors hope for a positive outcome to the disease based on the facts at hand. We hope for good weather based on the weather forecast, and so on and so forth. On the contrary, the notion of hope in the New Testament does not emanate from objective reality. We hope even when external facts indicate a hopeless situation. Whether we actually have a positive outcome or not, hope is on a level of its own. We Christians hope because Christ is what he is. And this triad of virtues that we heard, faith, hope, love, I'm under the impression that faith and the content of faith is nearer the true theological sense. When people talk about faith, then the content they lend to the word is quite near what the church understands as faith. There is a proximity to love. There is quite a lot of proximity, but less so than there exists with faith. In the theological content of love, where we have the greatest distance is in the notion of hope. What we mean when we say hope of Christians differs a lot from the New Testament sense of hope. That is, among the three virtues, Christians are further away in ecclesiastical terms in what concerns hope. We Christians hope in a different way, co-estimating different factors and ending with a forecast or a prayer of hope. While hope in the New Testament is something else. It's hope for what Christ is and not hope for a positive outcome. Here I'd like to make another pause, diverge from my text and say that if this assumption of mine is true, that is, that in our daily lives we do not understand these three virtues in their full theological content, then this is a sign that Christians, to a certain extent, lead a material life. That is, that we are materialists, not only practically regarding whether or not we consume a lot, but in the way in which we perceive these notions. For me to share with you a brief anecdote that I read somewhere and is related to the topic. It goes something like this. There is a phrase that consists of two words. When a person hears the phrase, they feel infinite joy. It is this phrase that every single person would like to hear, and they infuse, and it consists of two words. It was a quiz, in fact. What is it? Most people say, whatever could it be? Whatever could these words be? Whatever could the phrase be? I love you. This is a phrase that we want to hear. Love you, in two words in Greek. However, there is an answer that gives people greater joy than I love you, and this is the phrase, it's benign. To the extent that it happens to us to derive more joy from the phrase, it is benign, rather than I love you, we can understand that we are a little bit material and we understand notions differently, and it shows whether the theological content of hope and our perception of it coincide. The hope of Christians does not emanate from conditions of the present, but from the future, from what Christ has promised. Our hope is Christ himself. 3 times, Apostle Paul, in 3 different points, calls Christ our hope. And St. Basil the Great took this and he put it in his divine liturgy. Christ dominated time, and therefore it turned into a ripe time, a ripe moment for fruition of hope. This hope does not disappoint as against the hope of facts. If I forecast that the weather is going to be good, and I say, I hope that the weather will be fine, but it rains in the end, I'll be embarrassed. The hope that does not shame or disappoint is the one that has a totally different content, not based on facts. Within the framework of this presentation and after this introduction, I would like to elaborate on 3 aspects to hope, which are related to mental disturbance and mental disease, since the conventional ones that I mentioned at the beginning have been greatly elaborated on in theoretical and ascetic literature. All 3, as you'll see, sound a little bit paradoxical, if not sound like an oxymoron themselves. The first ones are anthropocentric and the last one is theological. The mental disturbance as a hopeful compromise. The prevalent perception regarding mental disorder is that it is an accident, while the mental development of a young person or the course of an adult could be expected to be better. There intervene certain pathological factors, biological predispositions, traumatizing conditions in life, negative emotion, stress, etc. And these factors divert towards pathology, hence the generation or induction of a disorder or disease. This literature explains part of the truth, but does not exhaust it. The study of the human unconscious reserves surprises. Some mental disorders are in effect a reaction on the part of the person's psyche that aims at either reparation or prevention of greater mental disturbance or damage. Let's bring to mind analogies on a physical level. A tick may aim at correcting a vision problem. Heart failure that occurred during the effort to cope with a pulmonary hypertension may be an example. A chronic muscular lesion in the process of counterbalancing a disc hernia or neurological complications. But regarding physical disturbances, when we have such compromise mechanisms, the diagnosis is more easily made because we have lab tests. But in mental disturbances, whereby the paraclinical testing process is rare, if not non-existent at all, sometimes it eludes us that this problem may be a manifestation not of weakness but of strength of the person's constitution. For such an ascertainment to come to light, we need clinical dexterity, psychotherapeutic skill, and existential sensitivity. A strictly biological psychiatry could not possibly approach the matter as a whole. They only see disorders. It takes a different approach to see that this disturbance could be a result of a mechanism that is in fact hopeful. So, as an example, an OCD personality, obsessive-compulsive disorder with inflexibility and rigid defenses, presents depression. It's a common phenomenon for OCD patients to have depression in the end, simply because the world around them cannot possibly compromise with what they expect, anticipate. In this sense, the particular depression, which is of course a mental disorder and cause for treatment, constitutes a victory, not a defeat. The person with this personality disorder will not go to the specialist on their own accord because they do not see their OCD features as a form of pathology. They'll go to the psychiatrist because they'll feel depressed and they'll experience depression. So depression is hope. Another field where we notice the hopeful compromise of mental disorder is exiting one's false self. False self is this condition whereby the child and then teenager grows alienated from the body, the emotions and desires, that is, from the passive part of the soul, and processes things mentally. So when this is a process that should take place in adolescence. Otherwise, it's going to be more painful and difficult, and there's no easy way of going about this transition. Then we may have an explosion, and we may have variegated symptomatology. We can have anxiety attacks, panic attacks, psychosomatic episodes. Of course, it sounds paradoxical for us to consider hopeful or hope-inspiring to see that we have such a symptomatology. What I'm implying, in fact, is that this is a crisis, and a crisis always serves as a junction. Therefore, there is inherent opportunity in normalizing development. Indeed, after some time and treatment, the person can actually go through this disorder, and patients can come to a better contact with their emotions and their desires. So, there are patients in which it's impossible to consolidate health without a prior rupture. Unfortunately, the problem is not always corrected. It doesn't always have a positive outcome because the psychopathology sometimes is strong enough to individualize itself and grow its own dynamics. But quite often, with proper treatment, it recedes or it gets better. But sometimes it becomes a chronic problem, and if it is repaired, then we have a psyche which is more integrated and more complete. So we are faced with a phenomenon which I called compromise scheme, that is, a compromise formation, which means that there is a form or a mechanism in the psyche that corresponds with the best possible solution at a time of trouble in order to cope with psychological burden. And in this respect, it is hope. This false self may be hope-inspiring, even though it's pathology, because it acts like a protective shell, so that the time will be ripe and the intrinsic flame of the healthy mental state will counterbalance. It protects a person from getting worse at the beginning. We have personality disorders. We have borderline passive-aggressive, histrionic, avoidant, dependent, and these disorders form themselves very early in life in order to prevent wounds from bringing about a collapse. They constitute a psychopathological phenomenon, but such a phenomenon that leaves room for hope. Such formations may follow teleology, which is subject not to mental health, but the spiritual sphere. And then we may have a psychopathology in order to prevent something from happening when one perceives it as a sin. For instance, one is dependent on alcohol, addicted to alcohol, which is something that causes pain to his wife and children. However, 10 years ago, his wife totally interrupted sexual contact with him. The person went to psychotherapist, and the therapist saw that there was a conflict. Early, the patient was faced with the dilemma of cheating on his wife, and he opted not to do so, and therefore he resorted to the introverted solution of alcoholism. Conscious or unconscious, this choice has a certain weight, and it indicates his spiritual course, because this person, in fact, wanted to avoid adultery. The message is not that this was the best way to have coped, but it was, in his respect, the best feasible time at that particular moment in time for that particular person, and this is what leaves room for hope. So, I'm thinking that, generally speaking, the crystallization of particular scenes or passions gains an unconscious but reasonable aspect or attribute. There is a reason why a passion or an addiction is generated, following a process that the person is not conscious of. The cost of such compromise formations bears at times the form or the vestments of a sin, and it is perceived as such by the clergy or the priest guiding the person. We are making mention to these formations in order to understand man, which will allow us to not look at snapshots, if you wish, of a person's course of life, but videos of psychodynamic struggle and offsetting. The truth does not lie in an evanescent snapshot, but it lies in a dynamic progress or course with the past. The aggression of a young person towards his parents may be considered sinful, but without it, perhaps the mental course of that particular teenager would have been more distorted. The phenomenon of hopeful compromise formations is reminiscent of what St. Maxim said, that what we simply call bad is not necessarily bad. It is bad in relation to something, but not bad in relation to something else. And what is called good is not good for all intents and purposes, but it is good vis-a-vis something and not something else. This is perception which is irreplaceable in a psychoanalytical approach, and this is very important for priests when evaluating passions and when assigning penance, but it's not highly applied, unfortunately, as it seems. Second, another aspect to hope in mental disorder lies in the revelation of hidden and neglected potential which the psychopathology brings to the surface. It sounds strange too, because up until today we had connected and correlated mental disturbance with less functionality. The mentally ill during acute or chronic stages of the disease is not in a position to fully capitalize on the gifts that God has bestowed upon them. Of course, it depends on the kind of pathology. Some pathologies, like schizophrenia, for instance, are indeed quite degrading for a person's psyche. However, many times mental illnesses have in them the seed of change as a likelihood, of course, and not as inevitability, which is obligatory. There are quite a few people who, in the distress of psychopathology, so slowly but gradually, new forms of personality emerged that they couldn't have imagined in the past. Why was that, do you think? For many reasons. First, because these particular people grew up with myths, for example, that they are weak or that they are strong. Second, because the structure of the family was so morbid, in fact, that it had trapped them into relational schemes that were problematic and prevented them from really getting to know themselves and their potential. 3, because during distress they lost any bearings they had, be they morbid or non-morbid, and they had to be flexible to survive. No matter what the reason was, the mental disorder acted as a catalyst for positive outcomes. Those that chose to tread the road of bravery and not of lamentation, those that behaved in a smart manner, looking on the bright side, ended up admitting and confessing the benefaction that was bestowed upon them because of the mental illness. As a notable case in point, I'll mention the young man who said, I'm grateful to God for allowing me to have these anxiety attacks because I can relate to people better. The girl who said, I truly needed the disorganization because up until that time I thought I was invulnerable. And there was another lady who said that depression gave her the impetus she needed to stand on her own feet after psychotherapy, of course. Here we need to remember that the betterment of personality corollary to mental illness comes through self-awareness, which is realized either by means of psychotherapy or pastoral guidance. In order to endeavor an analogy, mental illness is like physical pain, which attracts our attention and urges us to visit the doctor so as to find out what the reason of pain is. The doctor does not content themselves with driving the pain away. They delve into the reasons. So the mental health specialist should never limit themselves to getting patients to go back to where they were before the problem. We need to have the answer to questions such as, what can I learn from the experience? How can this change my life for the better? And so on and so forth. 3. And we'll go on to the third way in which hope is connected, or related rather, to mental disturbance. And there's a theological dimension to it, as I said at the beginning. I mentioned, starting, that there is spiritual progress achieved by many patients through pain or distress. However, there's one thing to evolve through humility, patience, and love, and another thing to discover Christ when everything hidden. There's the gist to the third aspect of hope, which is related to coming in contact with the person of Christ. Admittedly, in mental illnesses, we don't see impressive miracles of cures as happens with physical disease. The most likely progress of a mental disease is, despite the efforts of the patient, not to have a miraculous cure, but a certain improvement. This is something that needs to attract our attention to the fact that some mentally ill will never find cure, but they'll discover Christ through the loss of hope. Mental pain is a different reality. And despair or desperation in Christ is an entirely different state of affairs. It's not my term. Sometimes this is an expression that endeavors to combine the incombinable, especially with the fact that Christ is called our hope. Despair in Christ means despair and disappointment or disillusioned in ourselves, our expectations. This is a step that most people are not ready to take, and especially during the first years of life. It takes a lot of living, maturity, wounds, failures for one to be able to reach the stage of despair in Christ this time. Another oxymoron to the term. However can you find hope amidst despair? Here, hope alludes to the destination of man. Through distress or pain, the ill person will personally meet Christ in the present time and will live with him. Garen Sophron Zaharov coined this phrase, despair in Christ, describing his own experience, not regarding mental disease. He wrote, and I quote, "One lives at the same time in the darkness of death and in the hope of Christ and God." I was praying with a hope that stretched far beyond all forms of despair, but the culmination of his word was when he wrote, "The Lord gave me the grace of despair." He went on to say, "Finding myself in full desperation for my condition, the only thing that I could do was to fall totally back on Christ through a desperate hope, the grace of desperation, desperate hope." Obviously, this is a reality whereby usual phrases do not suffice to describe and definitely cannot comprise. In such conditions, people experience apophatically a desperate hope. Father Sophronius described these phenomena on a spiritual level. It had to do with his personal strive and progress. The question at hand here is whether desperation in Christ can be found not only in the experience of God abandonment during a hard spiritual struggle, during which the sense of grace withdraws temporarily, but also in mental illness. Is the despair of mental illness a place where there could be blooming of apophatic despair? The answer could be, why not? What would prevent this experience from reappearing, since the substrate is distress? Is there a difference in mentally ill people? Could it be, perhaps, that hope here is called upon to bloom in a psyche that has not remained intact, but has been affected in multiple ways? Indeed, man can be deprived of one's health, mobility, senses, but even at times of very serious disease or disability, man maintains the sense of control on the mental functions. That's why it's not by accident that sometimes we speak of ills and we evaluate mental disorders as the gravest of problems. We say that the most important thing is for us to be in our right minds. This is what common people say. Any loss of control in feelings, memory, is experienced as trauma. Despair in Christ is not content with emergence of hope, but it aims at the true experience of Christ. The degradation to the integrity of psyche that is brought about by the mental illness, is it something that facilitates or impedes one's personally coming in contact with God? In other words, the pain of mental distress acts in what way? Does it open the door or close it? If we take into account that we use our mental functions not only in order to approach God, but also to grow distant from Him, then It is not unlikely that an inhibition of some of the mental processes can open roads. This is something that can happen to mentally ill patients, but of course will need their own narrations. And after collecting them and evaluating them psychologically, we'll see that the distress of mental illness can be turned into a womb of hope. But here, great attention is needed so as not to make a confusion between the despair in Christ and other kinds of desperation that are so widespread in our times. Not every despair bears the apophatic despair in Christ. Most desperations are either malicious or dictated by evil. Mental illness is under certain circumstances possibly combinable with virtue or sanctity. Here I'd like to jot down a sagacious remark of Simon of Petra, Archimandrite of Eliseus. Virtue as a gift from God does not distinguish between people with a psychopathological problem or not, and is bestowed without exception upon those people that combine awareness of character with gifts and failures, and the proportionate effort to try and follow the commandments of the gospel. God blesses with grace both healthy and fragile vessels of men. This leads us to think that the miscellany of people with all the symptoms they bear are involved. He spoke of sanctity as a gift from God, and Father Sophronius talked about the grace of desperation. But man needs to prepare in an appropriate manner, as it so happens with every grace bestowed upon them. And here, indeed, I can't help thinking of how important the things that Father George said when he made his presentation today, elaborating on Apostle Paul. It takes a step of great maturity and grace for a man to end up bragging about the weaknesses. We pay great attention to our CVs and we decorate them with a lot of interesting details, and they constitute a narration of our strengths, not our weaknesses. And let's say that they are acceptable because we are called upon to make it in a public life. But when we are left alone with Christ alone, we should be able to write down a curriculum vitae of our weaknesses that will be written in such a way so that we can actually be actually be realistic of our weaknesses. What we said holds true for the present time. When the brightful and glorious day comes, then all discussions on hope will be lost, because as Apostle Paul said to the Corinthians, a hope seen is hope no more. I was always moved by the promise of the book of Revelation, because it bears witness to how seriously God sees the pain of man, and God will wipe away all tears from their eyes, and death will no longer exist, nor will there be mourning, crying, or pain, because the old ways, the old order has gone. We have a long way to go to make sure that mentally ill fellow human beings of ours will be able to hope as well. Thank you very much.